Joining us, and he is the powerhouse expert on all of these issues, our really good friend Steve Yates. He's a senior fellow at the America First Policy Institute and chair of the China Policy Initiative. And we're always so glad to see you. I hope you had a great Christmas. Happy New Year to you. So I guess my first question with this, and I'm not saying I'm a proud American republic. I just recoil at the thought of having a monarchy. However, I do realize that in a power vacuum, tyrants would love to exploit things like that. And when you have these smaller nations that do not have associations with economic powerhouses like the United States or Britain or France or whatever, then that's a really great opportunity for predatory tyrants like China to come in, promise all these great loans, say, but in return, we want preferential trade deals. We want your mineral rights. And I was reading through the list. There are tons of countries that have signed on to this where like a quarter of their GDP is debt to China. Talk to us a little bit about this, because that's why I think these associations, even though they seem weird and outdated and a lot of people don't know what the Commonwealth or some of these other trade partnerships are, they actually do kind of serve a purpose.
Well, Dana, you're right. In the framing of this really needs to be on China under the Communist Party being a very aggressive parasite on a global system for resources and other kinds of opportunity. People often forget, because there's been so much glitz and glamour in media coverage and scholarly analysis of China, that China under the People's Republic, which is the Communist Party country, they've invented no new technologies to improve the way of life of their own people, much less the world. All they can do is go out into the world and exploit. Now, colonialism was a real thing in the past, and it's a real thing now. But people really cheapen what that was when trying to compare today's Commonwealth relationships to those. I mean, I think in your newsletter, you made clear, there's no evidence at all that the Commonwealth relationship had anything to do with the treatment of the kind humans in these smaller Commonwealth countries. Whereas the Chinese opportunism really can hurt. When you look at One Belt, One Road, they go in and build stuff and they leverage loans. They have, in fact, destroyed one country in the world, Sri Lanka, with this over leveraging of finance, and it all ultimately comes due. But in all of these places, they come to find it's low quality, it's not reliable, it doesn't bring employment to their people. The Chinese masters bring in their own labor, so they don't even get the employment bump in these countries. That is actually truly exploitative and colonialist. Whatever Harry and his ilk are talking about, it's just divorced from what this reality is.
Yeah, and we're talking with our really good friend Steve Yates, and you can find him at YatesComms on Twitter as well. You had made the really good comment before, I think last year. You had said that everyone always talks about colonialism, but no one talks about Chinese colonialism and what they're doing through this Belt and Road. It is a chokehold. And then I saw, just like most recently, they're trying to now pave a similar Belt and Road initiative into British Columbia. There was this major warehouse facility under construction, and they're looking to use this. It's like almost a $200 million complex called the World Commodity Trade Center, a joint venture between the CCP company and a local development firm. I just think that considering what they're doing and their track record of breaking down other countries through, as you were talking about, just mentioning Sri Lanka, you would think, especially a nation like Canada, would be a little, I don't know, wiser about entering into agreements like this, because this is Canada. We just had the quote unquote Three Amigos conference. I don't know if that ever came up as a concern, from partners, United States and Mexico, but it just kind of shocks me how widespread this is, even though we've seen the history of the consequences of this.
Well, it is shocking in some ways and not shocking in others with regard to British Columbia. I sort of yearn for a Jesse Watters World walking down the street asking which country British Columbia is in, because most people would probably not guess Canada. But it is, in fact, an area where a huge number of Southern Chinese migrants moved. A lot out of Guangdong and the end of Hong Kong itself. And you would think that there's a higher degree of sensitivity among those populations about what the CCP did to Hong Kong, where I remind everyone there are political prisoners today. Yeah. My friend Jimmy Lai remains in prison, likely going to be awaiting trial under this national security law all of this calendar year. And he is seeking redress by way of the British government because he's a British citizen, because he lived under this system, this Commonwealth. And so there's a very real security blanket and connective tissue among these societies for citizens who can't rely as a small country on their own government alone, but by being a part of something larger, they at least have some breath of hope should bad policies or bad actions by China or others come into play, that they've got power in numbers. So it's a very real thing. And really, it's shame on British Columbia's leadership not to be more protective of it. I've given up expecting the young, charismatic leader of Canada to try to take the right China policy on things. He is actually part of the problem when it comes to seeing China clearly. The rest of the so-called Five Eyes countries, I think, have passed a sobriety checkpoint and seem to be trending back in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. And there was actually a very shockingly a somewhat insightful piece that was published at Washington Post. America needs a better China strategy, a China trade strategy. Is it? I mean, I think it's pretty accurate to say that one of the reasons they've been able to grow so quickly in terms of flexing their economic muscle is because of the waning of United States and Britain and France and I think our consumer habits as well play into that. That's fairly accurate to say.
All of those things play a role, but really, dumb Americans implementing dumb policy have done a lot to make America dumber and weaker. And I wish I would never have to say such things, but we made a bad bet with regard to pouring technology and capital and opportunity into China. There ought to be one of those stickers on every gas pump in China when it comes to their economy that they can't really claim any credit. We did that. But the thing is, we gave them this power and this leverage that they now use to strengthen a military, to challenge neighbors, and to undermine our own institutions. So we did that. The good news part of that means we can change course. We can build a new path forward. It'll take time. It'll be expensive, just like the one that we built for them. But we have to change that course. And the Congress, with this new select committee on China, I think is making a down payment on that broader policy shift.
That's
It's
exactly
a
what I
small
was going to
move
ask
in
you
some
about.
ways. It's an important move.
Yeah, that I was just going to ask you, what would you like to see with this new Congress? And I think that committee is a great one. I know you and I think are on the same page and maybe some would view us as a little bit more draconian when we look at trade practices with China. But what would you like to see the House do? Last question for you as we start this new year.
Yeah, well, I mean, number one, I think there's some simple principles that ought to be followed. No one from China should be able to do in the United States what Americans and American organizations can't do in China. No American or entity should be engaged in activity that makes an enemy stronger and gives it more tools to use against us, not just in competition, but in even worse ways. And so reciprocity and stop feeding a threat should be some very simple principles. My friend and colleague, Bob Lighthizer, coined this term strategic decoupling because it'll take time and it won't be in all areas, but we have to find a way to eliminate our reliance on China for strategically significant goods. And so that process is underway. We have to accelerate it. It's going to cross jurisdictions. That's why this select committee is important. It's not going to solve everything, but conversations about China have to marry up foreign policy and education policy, energy policy and national security policy, supply chains with things that have to do with protecting core institutions in the United States. Homeland security has to be rolled in with it, along with immigration. I just end on what I think is the single greatest external threat to American families and communities today, and it's the nexus of China, cartels, an open border, and fentanyl. It has hurt dearly my family and many, many other families, and it makes every state a border state. And it is, I think, one of the biggest challenges of our time. And only this select committee has the jurisdiction to take on kind of that multi-headed hydra. You put it into any one of those silos and we fail.
That's a great point. Well stated. Can't add anything to that. Steve Yates, as always, very good to see you, my friend. So appreciate your expertise on this and boiling it all down for everybody to understand. It's so helpful. Thank you. So good to see you.
Thank you, Dana. Take care.
Of course, you too.